pack your things and get out. This is my house now, and you are not welcome here." She said it the same way you'd tell someone their parking spot was taken. Calm, flat, like I was an inconvenience she'd been waiting to remove. My son had been in the ground for less than 4 hours. I stood there in the hallway of the house my father built, the house where my son took his first steps, where he rode his bicycle on the back porch until he scraped both knees clean, where he brought her home for the first time and looked at me with that nervous grin like he was waiting for my approval. And I could not make my mouth work. I was 67 years old and I had just buried my boy, and my daughter-in-law was standing there with her arms crossed and her chin up, waiting for me to leave. "I don't think you heard me," she said. I heard her just fine. "My name is Elton. I spent 41 years building a small manufacturing business in central Ohio, the kind of place that never makes the news but keeps a town alive. 30 employees at our peak, good benefits, Christmas bonuses when the year went well. My late wife Margaret and I raised one son, Colin, in a house on Maple Creek Road that her father had started and I had finished. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, 2 acres of yard that Colin mowed every Saturday from the time he was 12. We were not wealthy people, we were careful people. There is a difference. Colin was 44 when he died. Pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed in March and gone by September. That is how fast it moves. One day he called me from his office sounding tired, said he'd been having some stomach trouble. 6 months later, I was picking out a casket. I keep thinking I should have more to say about that period, more details, more memories to hold onto. But grief has a way of compressing time until all you're left with is a few sharp images. The hospital room, the sound of the machines, the way he squeezed my hand on the last morning and trying to say something he didn't have the breath for. He'd married Sherry 3 years before the diagnosis. I want to be fair here. In the beginning, she seemed fine. She was younger than Colin by about 12 years, worked in real estate, always put together, always on her phone. She was polite enough at the holidays and she made him happy, or at least he seemed happy, which is all a father can really know from the outside. But when he got sick, something shifted, not right away. In the beginning, she was present. She came to the appointments. She spoke to the doctors. But as the months went on, I started noticing things. She'd step out during visits and come back 20 minutes later with no explanation. When I called the house, she often didn't pass the phone to Colin right away. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself mean nothing because you don't want to believe what they might mean. The last month, Colin asked me to help him with his affairs. He said he wanted to make sure things were handled properly. We spent 3 Saturdays together going over paperwork at the kitchen table while Sherry was out. I didn't ask questions. I helped him organize documents, drove him to see his attorney, a man named Rosenthal, who had handled business matters for me years ago. Colin was very methodical about the whole thing. He wanted every detail correct. I thought he was just being thorough. He had always been thorough. He died on a Tuesday in late September. It was a clear day, which I remember thinking seemed wrong. The sky had no business being that blue. The funeral was held that Thursday. The church was full. Neighbours, people from town, former employees of mine who'd known Colin since he was a boy carrying a lunch pail to his mother's car. One of them, a retired foreman I'd worked with for 20 years, drove 3 hours from Pittsburgh. That meant something to me. Sherry organised most of the service. I didn't fight her on it. It was her husband, and she had every right. But there were small moments that sat wrong with me. She positioned herself at the front of every receiving line. When people offered condolences to me, she'd step slightly in front, redirect the conversation back to herself. At the graveside, she wept loudly, dramatically, in a way that made the people around her exchange glances they thought I couldn't see. My neighbour Walt drove me home. I've ridden with him to the cemetery because I hadn't felt safe driving and my truck was already back at the house. The reception after was held at my house, our house, the family house, because it was the largest gathering space any of us had, and because that was simply what you did in our community. I tried to grieve properly. I stood in my own living room and accepted casseroles and handshakes and told people thank you. I'm holding up. Yes, it was fast. Yes, he went peacefully. I did what you do. Around 7 in the evening, most of the guests had gone. Sherry came to find me in the kitchen. I was washing a dish that didn't need washing, just to have something to do with my hands. She said, I need to talk to you about the house. I set the dish down. She said the will reading was the following morning. She said she already knew the terms. She said the house, the business accounts, and the investments, everything had been placed in her name. She said she'd been generous enough to let the reception happen here, but that she needed me to understand going forward that this was her property and her decision-making. I looked at her for a long moment. I said I thought we should wait for the official reading before making any decisions. She said the decisions were already made. The will reading was at Rosenthal's office the next morning. Just the three of us, me, Sherry, and the attorney. The way a will reading is supposed to be done. Private, no audience. Rosenthal read through the document carefully. It was true that Colin had left Sherry the house, the business accounts, and the bulk of the financial investments. Approximately $2.3 million in total. I watched her face as those numbers were read aloud. She kept her expression controlled, but I could see the satisfaction moving just beneath it. Then Rosenthal paused. He looked up over his reading glasses and said, There are additional terms. Sherry's expression didn't change. Go ahead. He said Colin had established a separate trust, funded independently and not subject to the primary will. The trust contained the manufacturing business's intellectual property, its client contracts, and the property deed, the deed to Maple Creek Road. Sherry said, What property deed? Rosenthal explained that 18 months before his death, Colin had transferred title of the Maple Creek Road property into a family trust with me as sole beneficiary. The house, the land, and all structures. The transfer had been completed legally, properly recorded at the county clerk's office, and was entirely separate from the estate Sherry had inherited. Sherry said, That's not possible. Rosenthal said it was not only possible, it was complete. That house has been in my family for 51 years, I said. I didn't plan to say it. It just came out. She turned to look at me for the first time since we'd sat down. The controlled expression was gone. What replaced it was something cold and calculating. She was running numbers. I could see it, looking for the angle, the loophole, the way through. He had no right, she said. He had every right, Rosenthal said quietly. The property had never been legally transferred into marital assets. The original deed was in Elton's name. Colin's transfer of it to a family trust was a straightforward legal action. She said she was going to contest it. Rosenthal said she was welcome to try. She pushed back from the table and looked at me like I had done something to her, like I was the one who had engineered something. I hadn't known. Not exactly. I thought back to those 3 Saturdays at the kitchen table. The paperwork, the careful organising, the trips to this very office. Colin hadn't told me what he was arranging, not specifically, but he'd asked me once, toward the end, while we were sitting together in the quiet of the house, asked me if I'd be okay. Not physically. He knew I was physically fine. He meant, would I be okay? I told him I would. He said, I know, Dad, I just want to make sure. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew who she was by then. He'd had 6 months in a hospital bed to know. I drove back to Maple Creek Road that afternoon, and I walked through every room. I stood in the kitchen where my father had put in the original cabinets. I stood on the back porch where Colin had ridden that bicycle. I stood in the doorway of the room that had been his as a boy, still with the same window frame he painted green when he was 15, because he wanted it to look like a sports car, and I tried to let what had happened settle into me properly. Sherry called 3 times that evening. I didn't answer. She called once more the following morning. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't listen to the message. 2 days after the will reading, she showed up at the door. I answered because I am not the kind of man who hides. She was composed when she knocked, but composure slipped pretty fast. She said she understood that Colin had made certain legal arrangements, but that surely we could come to some reasonable agreement. She said she had nowhere to go. She said the house she thought she was inheriting had turned out not to be available, and the liquid assets were tied up in estate processing, and she needed a place to live while things got sorted out. I want to say I felt something. Sympathy, or pity, or even just the mild human discomfort of watching someone ask for something they're not going to get. I tried to locate that feeling. I couldn't find it. I thought about her standing in that hallway with her arms crossed, telling me to pack my things. I thought about my son, 44 years old, having to spend his last weeks making sure his father wouldn't be thrown out of his childhood home by the woman he'd married. I thought about what that had cost him, the energy, the legal back and forth, the knowing that his own wife required that kind of protection against. I told her I was sorry she found herself in a difficult situation. She looked at me like that wasn't the response she expected. I told her that the house was mine and had been mine for a long time before any of this happened, and that I didn't have any arrangement to offer her. She said, "You're really going to do this to me?" I said I hadn't done anything. I said I was going to ask her to leave now. She stood on the porch for a moment. I don't know what she was waiting for me to change my mind, or for some other card to play that she hadn't found yet. Then she turned and walked back to her car. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a while. The house was quiet the way it gets in late October, with the furnace just starting to kick on for the season. I could hear the faint metal tick of the pipes warming up, the same sound I'd heard every fall for 50 years. My son had thought about this. He had sat in this house, sick and exhausted and running out of time, and he had thought carefully about what would happen after. He had done the work, made the calls, signed the papers, all without making it a drama or a decoration. He had just quietly made sure. That is the kind of man he was. He didn't leave me money. He didn't need to. He left me the thing that actually mattered, the thing that couldn't be sold out from under me by someone who decided the family name on the deed was just a technicality. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd spread all that paperwork, where he'd looked through every document with that same careful attention he'd had since he was a boy, and I just sat there for a while. There was a casserole in the refrigerator that someone from the church had brought over. I got it out and heated it up and ate it at that table and watched the backyard go dark through the window. Sherry retained an attorney and filed a challenge to the trust. Rosenthal told me it went nowhere. The transfer had been clean, the documentation was airtight, and there was no legal basis to undo it. The whole process took about 4 months before her attorney apparently advised her to drop it. I haven't spoken to her since she stood on my porch that afternoon. The business I retired from a while back, but Colin had kept certain contracts active under a subsidiary structure, and those contracts, the intellectual property piece that went into the trust, turned out to generate a modest continuing income. Not life-changing. Enough! I still mow the lawn on Saturdays, though these days I use a riding mower because my knees aren't what they were. I painted the window frame in Colin's old room, not green this time, just white, the way everything else is. But I stood on the ladder and ran the brush along that frame and thought about him, and it didn't feel like loss exactly. It felt like carrying something. There are days when I walk through this house and the silence is heavy. Margaret has been gone 11 years and now Colin is gone, and I am 67 years old living in the house my father built, and that is just the shape of things. But the house is still here, and I am still here, and on the mantel there is a photograph of Colin at about age 9 standing on this very back porch with a bicycle, and both knees scraped raw and the biggest grin you have ever seen on a child's face. He knew what he was doing, right up to the end. That's more than enough. I keep coming back to those 3 Saturdays at the kitchen table. Colin, sick and exhausted and running out of time, sitting across from me with a stack of documents and reading every page twice. He didn't make speeches about it. He didn't sit me down and say, "Dad, here's what I'm doing and why." He just did the work. Quietly, carefully, completely. That is the part that stays with me. There is something in how a person behaves when no one is watching, or when they think they have nothing left to gain, that tells you everything about who they really are. Sherry thought she had won. She had the number in her head, 2.3 million, and she stood in that hallway with her arms crossed like a person who believed the math settled the matter. But Colin had already understood something about her that the math couldn't fix. He'd seen it clearly enough to spend his last weeks building a wall she couldn't climb. That kind of clear-sightedness, the ability to look at a situation without flinching and do what is necessary even when you're dying. I don't have a clean word for it. I just know it when I see it, and my son had it. What Sherry had was the opposite. Not stupidity. She was not a stupid woman. What she had was the kind of thinking that confuses ownership with worth, that believes whoever holds the deed holds the meaning. She looked at this house and saw an asset. Colin looked at it and saw his grandfather's hands in the cabinets, and his mother's garden on the south side, and his own childhood tracked into the floorboards. Those are not the same thing, and you cannot inherit the second by taking the first. I'm not angry at her anymore. I was, for a while. Anger is reasonable. But I've found that staying angry at someone like Sherry is like staying angry at weather. It is just what she is. What happened was not a punishment she received. It was simply the natural result of who she chose to be running up against, the natural result of who Colin chose to be. Cause and consequence. You do not need anything beyond that to explain it. What I want to carry forward from all of this, and I mean this for myself as much as anything, is the understanding that doing right by people is not just a moral nicety. It is a kind of infrastructure. Colin built something solid over the years, a reputation for honesty, a relationship with an attorney who trusted his intentions, a paper trail that reflected the truth of what this family had built. When the moment came, that infrastructure held. Sherry had built nothing like it. She had only the assumption that possession was enough. I think about that when I'm tempted to cut a corner or let something slide. The house is still here because someone cared enough to do things correctly when it was hard and painful, and there was no obvious reward. That is the only inheritance that cannot be contested. Colin was 44 years old. He did not have enough time, but he used what he had with a kind of precision and decency that I am still learning from, which maybe means that in the ways that count, he is not entirely gone. The window frame in his old room is painted white now. I did it myself, up on the ladder with my knees, complaining the whole time. It looks fine. The room looks fine. And every time I walk past it, I think, he knew what he was doing, right up to the end. That is more than enough.